Welcome to Craft Brew. Let's make some mead. Mead making can be incredibly simple with just a few ingredients. You need honey, water, yeast, and some nutrient for your yeast so you can have a healthy fermentation. This is the Craft Brew Mead Making Kit, and today we're going to walk through what's in the box and how to make your first mead. Let's take a look at what's in the box. First off, your guide to making mead. This includes your process information and your ingredients. Also included is a little packet with your airlock and some other gear. That gear includes a stopper, a 3-piece airlock, a cap for the end of your siphon tubing, and a hose clamp. Your kit also includes this bag. Inside this bag are a packet of yeast, your no-rinse sanitizer solution, and 2 packets of nutrients. These are your staggered nutrient additions for your yeast. Yeast turns sugars, like the sugars in this honey, into alcohol. But sugar isn't enough for the yeast to complete a healthy fermentation. So adding nutrients, make sure they have the vitamins, amino acids, and other things that they need in order to complete a healthy fermentation with less risk of off flavors and stalled fermentation. More on that in a bit. Opening up the rest of our kit, we find a 1-gallon jug, our tubing for racking, a funnel to add things to our jug, and racking cane. The racking cane is used in conjunction with the siphon tubing to transfer your mead off to its secondary container after fermentation. You'll see that in a bit. Now that we've got everything unpacked, let's take a look at the ingredients for this very simple mead recipe, starting with our honey. Here, we're going to use clover honey, but you could also use wildflower honey or any honey varietal that is accessible to you. I'd recommend checking out orange blossom honey for something that is really excellent in a mead. And next we have our yeast. Here we're using D47. D47 is a strong, robust, clean fermenter and works great at home temperatures below about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It can take a higher ABV mead to semi-dry, and it should give us a lovely product in this mead. And then, like mentioned previously, we have our staggered nutrient additions. The reason we're going to stagger our nutrients instead of giving the mead all the nutrients right up front is because it helps us avoid temperature spikes that can lead to off flavors in our fermentation. See, the yeast really like to eat sugar, and the yeast really like to eat nitrogen that is accessible to them. And this is their nitrogen source in this mead, because honey doesn't bring any of its own nitrogen with it. And yeast need nitrogen to thrive. Think of it this way. Giving the yeast honey is like giving a kid candy. They love candy, but they can't thrive on candy alone. They need their fruits and vegetables. And that's kind of what it's like adding nutrient to our mead. We're giving them a more well-balanced diet. Now our yeast really like this form of nitrogen, and they're gonna go for it. So if we put it all in there up front at the beginning of fermentation, those yeast are gonna gobble it up, and that's gonna create hotter and hotter fermentation temperatures inside the jug. Hotter fermentation temps can lead to off flavors that make your mead taste bad and can take a long time to age out. So by giving our yeast a balanced diet, by staggering their nutrient over the course of primary fermentation, we avoid that problem. So you get better tasting mead sooner. Nutrients. It's like magic for mead fermentation. All right, now we're ready to make some mead, but first we gotta sanitize all of our gear. Sanitizing is important because it helps ensure that the only microbes inside of our fermentation vessel are the ones that we put in there. In this case, yeast. So we're going to open up our packet of no-rinse sanitizer and pour half of it into a container. Here I'm using a 1-gallon bucket. Then we're gonna add 1 gallon of water. And tap water would work just fine for this. Then anything that's gonna touch our mead needs to touch our sanitizer. You want to make sure everything that you sanitize spends about 60 seconds in contact with that sanitizer. So what I like to do is just sanitize everything and lay it out on a paper towel to dry. And since this is a no rinse sanitizer, you don't have to rinse it. So just set everything out, let it dry a little bit, and then we can move on to making some mead. All right, everything's now sanitized. Let's weigh out some honey. And for this recipe, we're using 2.5 pounds of honey in a 1 gallon batch. For easy reference, 1 cup of honey weighs 12 ounces. So if you don't have a fancy scale, for this recipe, you could use 3 1/3 cup of honey for the 1 gallon batch. All right, this is where the fun begins. We're gonna mix up a mead. Let's start by putting half of our water into the carboy. Then we're gonna put 1/3 of our honey into the carboy. Then we'll take our sanitized stopper, put it in the neck of the carboy, take our sanitized thumb, place it over the hole, and give it a shake. Once that's dissolved, we'll add another 1/3 of our honey. And that's pretty well mixed. All right, before we add the rest of our spring water, we're gonna add the day 1 packet of nutrients. So that goes right in, and we'll give it another shake to dissolve. Now, look for the 1 gallon marking on your jug. We're gonna fill the jug up just above those raised letters. And now we're gonna give it one final shake. And now we're at perhaps the most crucial step in our mead making adventure, pitching our yeast. We're gonna add this entire 5-gram packet into this 1 gallon jug, and the yeast will convert the sugars in our honey water must into alcohol, turning it into mead. So just snip off the top and pour it right in. Next, before we put our stopper in, we're gonna make sure the neck of the carboy is nice and clean and dry using a dry paper towel. We also want to ensure that our stopper is nice and dry, so that way it doesn't slip out of the neck of the carboy. The last thing we gotta do is put in our 3-piece airlock. So, shove that down inside of your stopper, add a little bit of water up to the fill line, and then place on the cap. The airlock acts as a one-way valve, the water being the valve. The gases generated by fermentation can escape through the airlock, but the liquid in the airlock prevents any bad buggies like other yeasts, molds, even fruit flies from getting into your mead. You always want to keep an eye on the fill level in your airlock to make sure it doesn't run dry. So we'll set a timer for 24 hours and we'll come back and add our next addition of nutrients. We're back here on day 2, and as you can see, the mead has really started to kick off. There's good fermentation activity, nice signs of fermentation in that CO2 coming out of the airlock, and of course you can see these ascending bubbles coming up the side of the jug, bursting at the top of our mead. It's safe to say that fermentation has successfully and aggressively started. So now we need to give it our second nutrient addition. How we're going to do that is we're going to divide this packet up into 2 bowls because we have a day 2 and day 5 nutrient addition in this packet. So we're going to split it between these bowls, degas our mead, and then add our nutrient. That looks pretty even. All right, before we add our nutrients, we need to degas our mead. There's a lot of carbon dioxide suspended in here, and adding your nutrients to a fermenting must can cause an explosion. I'm talking a literal geyser out the top of your fermenter. Imagine your nutrient additions like little grains of sand. They're bumpy, and when CO2 gathers on those bumps, it collects into bigger and bigger bubbles that eventually leave the surface of the nutrient and travel to the top. That's where your geyser comes from. So if we can get as much of the CO2 out of here as possible before adding our nutrients, we can avoid having an eruptive experience out of our carboy and losing some of our mead. So here's how to degas. We're going to loosen our airlock and we're going to give it a little bit of a swirl. And what you'll see is a lot more bubbles coming up from the bottom and bursting at the surface. We want to keep swirling this over and over again until we stop seeing so many bubbles coming to the top. So just intermittent swirling here and there for about 2 minutes until all that activity kind of ceases. Another great thing about degassing our mead is that carbon dioxide can be kind of toxic to the yeast. It creates a sort of inhospitable environment for fermentation. So releasing a bunch of that CO2 actually does help improve your fermentation. This looks pretty well degassed. I know there's still a little bubbles coming up at the top, but we're gonna see what happens when we add a little bit of our day 2 nutrients. And I'm using a small spoon here and just adding a little bit at a time. As you can see, that is releasing even more bubbles, but because we released so much of the CO2, we're not getting that eruptive effect. And it's okay to take your time with this. You're not hurting anything by leaving your airlock off for a little bit. All right, now we should be able to add the last little bit. We have successfully avoided an eruption. So, time to put our airlock back on and give it one more swirl just to make sure everything is mixed in from the top. And then we'll see this mead again in a few days. It's day 5. Fermentation is still ongoing with our mead, so we're going to make that final staggered nutrient addition. So again, we will degas the mead and add our nutrients in slowly so we don't get a foam over. And then we'll put our mead away for another few weeks and allow fermentation to complete. We're planning on bottling this mead in about 10 days. So we're gonna do some aggressive degassing on this to try and get any of the remaining CO2 in suspension to lift up and out of there, because it's gonna get in the way of us getting a super clear mead when we go to bottling. So we're just gonna loosen the top of the airlock just a bit, keeping some pressure on it, and we're just gonna swirl it. We're gonna swirl it quite a bit for 2 to 3 minutes. And yes, that's gonna mix some of the stuff that's down here in the bottom up into it, but that will all settle back out as it will not be getting carried up and around throughout the mead with that CO2 that's still kind of trying to gas out. So let's give it some swirls, and then we will be back in 10 days to get this thing bottled. All right, it's been a full month. Our mead's crystal clear. It's time to get it into bottles. We're gonna be using swing top bottles here, but you could also use the bottling kit from BREW. We mixed up the remainder of our sanitizer. We sanitized all the bottles and our gear, and we're gonna be using this bowl of boiled and cooled water to get our siphon going. We're gonna be using gravity, using a siphon to rack the mead into these bottles. So to do that, we'll need our racking cane and that cap that's on the bottom of the racking cane, and we're going to need our racking tubing. We'll also need our hose clamp, and we've put it on the end of our tubing here. Now we're just gonna fill it with this sterile water, making sure to close our clamp off in that bowl of water. And this takes just a minute to get all the air bubbles out and get it filled. Okay, once that tube is entirely full of water, we will attach it to the end of our racking cane. And the water vacating the tube is going to start the suction that's going to allow us to pull the mead out of our jug and into our bottles. Now we remove our airlock very gently, and then we will place our racking cane inside the jug. And then for a little bit of reassurance, I'm going to use a chip clip to keep my tube from falling all the way inside the jug. Then we just open our clamp and we'll stop it when the mead starts flowing. Right there. And then that begins our bottle filling process. And we want to get our tube all the way to the bottom, so we're filling our bottles from the bottom. And there we go, 4 bottles of fresh mead. And you may get a little bit of cloudiness in that last bottle. That's the one we like to just, put in the fridge and drink first. If you do put it in the fridge, some of that leftover sediment that may have gotten in your bottle will settle out to the bottom, and then you can just carefully pour, leaving that sediment behind. Those first 3 bottles we got are nice and clear. Looks beautiful. Now, these are ready to drink now, but you could, put them back and let them age for a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year. In a mead like this, you can typically expect to improve all the way up to about 2 to 3 years of aging. Now, there are some ways that you can riff on the recipe included with this kit, including you could put fruit or spices into your primary fermentation vessel, or consider replacing some or all of your water with a fruit juice. Or if you decide that you want something a little bit sweeter, you can use the Brew Mead Back Sweetening Kit to stabilize and back sweeten your mead to bring some of that sweetness back to it to enhance those honey flavors. Making mead or wine or beer at home is not as complicated as it may initially seem, and we know that you can make great mead at home. So enjoy your Brew Mead Making Kit and let us know in the comments how your mead turned out. Until next time, happy brewing.